Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about desensitization and counterconditioning. And this is a really kind of big topic that a lot of people have tried or have done it and have it not work because they're missing a component or something to that effect, or they're not watching their dog, or one of the many, many things. So we thought this is a good one just to go through some tips. And we probably all have a couple of tips that we've learned and that have helped us. So we're going to start with just a couple. And first, I want to talk about the reason that you use desensitization and counterconditioning is because your dog is having an emotional response to something. So using Azul as an example, he's always my example, but so he gets extra excited around other dogs that he doesn't know. So we've been working for quite some time to get him used to that, to make that be kind of a non-thing so that he's not bothered by it. So his emotions are not negative emotions, but he's so excited that he can easily go over a threshold if we don't work on it regularly. So I will use the desensitization and in forms of games and rewards and reinforcement around dogs that he's not actively engaging with them, he's engaging with me to try to help build his engagement with me more. So the whole point of desensitization is changing their emotions, whether it's a negative emotion or a happy emotion. You want to bring it down so it's not such a strong emotion to whatever it is, so that the dog basically looks at whatever that distraction is. It goes, yeah, not my business. I don't care. And then they are back with you and more focused on you. So when you're trying to change their emotions, the best way to change their emotion, typically you think of it in a scary situation, like your dog is afraid of something. When Azul was a little puppy, he was afraid of a fire hydrant. Something really simple, easy. But so to change his emotions for that fire hydrant, I was able to pair every time we had to walk anywhere near it, which thankfully we had one we could practice that we didn't have to walk past closely. But anytime we walked anywhere near it, I could give him some high value food reinforcement. And then slowly over time, we could get a little bit closer and then walk up and actually touch it. And once he touched it, he was like, oh, yeah, okay. And then we did the same thing with a Bigfoot statue. And this Bigfoot statue was over 6 foot tall. So I understand why that one was a little scary. It was in kind of a lurky type pose. But so you want to change the emotion so it becomes not a scary object or not an overexciting object like the dogs right now in Azul's life, because dogs are so fun. They overexcite him. So you have to pair that with a reinforcement that they really want. It has to be a high value reinforcement. So the easiest one for that is food for most dogs, because food, you can, get the yummiest of foods, salmon, sardines, liver, something to that effect, and pair it with something that is scary or overexciting, or one that I did with Azul with dogs is his flirt pole. When we first got his flirt pole, that was one of his top high reinforcements. So I was able to take his long line and his flirt pole and work starting at about 200 feet away from the dog park, where it was easy for him to want to play with me still and slowly get closer. So just make sure that you're pairing whatever reinforcement is high value for your dog in the situation. Food is always going to be easiest, but if your dog is not food motivated, you're going to have to look for other reinforcements that you can pair to help get them more engaged with you and more focused on you and want what you have more than whatever that other distraction is that they either want to get to or get away from. And so, Cindy, I'll turn it over to you so you can kind of explain the distance side of desensitization.
Okay, so when I got Nick, when he was a puppy, nobody would have thought he would have been a service dog. And then to add to it, 2 weeks after he came home, California went into full on shelter in place, and we weren't really supposed to go outside other than like maybe your backyard. So it was rather exciting getting him as a young puppy to experience people and objects that weren't in my backyard. And a lot of that was going back and forth on how close could we get to something and backing off to the point where he could tolerate it. And you really have to watch your dog when you're doing this, that they don't go over threshold, because you might want to bring them pretty close to threshold, and so that they see that it's not going to hurt them, and then take them away, because you want to be able to get a response. You want to be able to show them it's not going to hurt them, it's not going to chase them. And and that you're going to keep them safe. It's kind of like if you see, like if you're out hiking and you see a bear in the woods and it's way off in the distance, you're probably not going to worry about it. But if it was 10 feet from you, you're going to be a lot more concerned about the bear. Well, you have to make it so that the dog, if it sees something that it equates to the bear way off in the distance, it's not going to freak out over that. And this could be something good, like Nick is always looking for something to hunt, like squirrels and birds and cats. And it's taken, he's 2.5 now. It's taken 2.5 years to get him so he doesn't want to chase squirrels and cats and birds when he's on leash. And it's been a lot of just back and forth, how far distance, how close can he get to the squirrel? How far do I have to have him away from the squirrel before he starts acting like he's getting excited, and then backing him off? It's like Penny was saying with the playing with the distance at the dog park with Azul, that she had to start off at 200 yards or so and gradually move him forward. Well, that's what you're doing with this distance with the counter conditioning and the desensitization. It's super, super important. And a lot of this can be done when you're working with the distance. If you're working on moving closer, you can do this without food, because you can relieve the pressure of moving them, of the scary thing, by moving them back and then moving them a little bit further, see how they do. If they look like they're getting uncomfortable, get them back and get the pressure off of them. And that actually helps them to learn how to cope with being calmer around something. And then as they get used to doing that, letting them approach on their own pace. With Nick, I often had a long line on him, so that when he was a puppy, so that when we were meeting people, because nobody wanted to touch anybody or anything at that point in time, I used to let the long line loose and let him approach people on his own. And that way he got to see that other people weren't a problem or upset to him or upsetting to him, and that they were friendly to him. But it takes time. I mean, I've been doing some counter conditioning and desensitization with barking just at random noises with Nick for quite a while. And you'll notice as we do Zooms, I think Sarah and I've been talking on Zooms and Messenger for about a little over a year now, and she probably has noticed a difference in Nick and how much barking he does versus now. I mean, he's gone down significantly, and same with Christy's dog Hodar. She's got him to decrease the amount of barking on a chat or a Zoom. So, and it depends on, is there a squirrel right outside the window? Are there kids running back and forth? How close are things to the dog? And eventually you want them to be able to, like the dog not to freak out if it's in a downstay and a kid jumps over them. I mean, that's ideal, but that's not where you're going to start with the downstay. But the other thing is it takes time. And I think that's something a lot of people, Penny, would you agree that it takes a lot of, with the time, a lot of people don't give it enough time?
Yeah, it's not an overnight thing, and it all depends on how far away you have to start. The further away you have to start, the
Yeah.
longer it's gonna take you to reach the goals generally. Not always, but generally.
Yeah.
So you do have to allow time. That did bring up another couple of points, but I'm gonna put them in the chat. So if we wanna switch over to the tips and questions from other people, we're gonna do tips first. So if you open your chat screen, if you have a general kind of category of a tip, so I'm going to tell you right now, one of the categories I'm going to put in there is flooding or the trigger stacking kind of thing. Those are categories that go into this and might have tips that involve it. So if we put them in the chat, anyone else who wants to add things to that chat, just put your stuff in the list, and the ones that have the most are the ones that we'll end up talking about first. So it doesn't matter if somebody else has already put it in there. Put your best topic in there that you think are most important to discuss tonight. And so if for some reason you have a problem with the chat, then go ahead and tell us what your topics would be right now. All right, let's go into the reading the dog's body language. Just beforehand, before we start that one, I want to kind of just be generalized. Let's try to keep it to the body language that you are specifically talking about with desensitization and counterconditioning. There's a whole lot of body language where we could do a whole Zoom on just that. So let's try to stick to the specific things that apply to body language now. So I do believe,
Penny, I also
ahead.
think it's important that we just quickly note that this isn't necessarily saying it's positive or negative body language. Excitement is excitement, whether they're excited to go play because they want to go play, or excited scared because they want to run away. We still, either way, we want to deal with that excitement level versus dealing with the dog that we're trying to rouse up.
Right, let's just try to stick with the body language that we're speaking about in our tips, and specifically the common stuff we see with the desensitization and counterconditioning. And so if you're not talking, mute yourself, please. If you want to add to that specific topic, then you can unmute yourself as soon as you think somebody is about done talking. Patty, I think you were the person to put that in there, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and let you kind of discuss what you meant by watching body language.
You're muted, Patty.
Actually, I think I was the one who mentioned it anyway. Go ahead, Patty.
Patty's still muted. Can you request that she unmute?
Everyone should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay, I can. I'm sitting here talking with the mute on. I was just saying it's very important how you deliver the food, the mechanics that you have. When the trigger appears, Dog sees it, that's when the food bar opens. Trigger disappears, that's when the food bar closes. You don't ever give it before the dog sees it or before it gets here. You want the scary thing to predict the food, not the food to predict the scary thing.
That's a very good point. If you do it backwards, you can mess it up. Do you want to talk a little bit about the body language in general, the kind of things to watch out for?
Are you asking me or who are you asking who to put that
Put that
in?
in comment first. So do you want to address that first?
John's got his hand up.
Okay, John can do it.
Yeah, I think I was the one who mentioned it in all at the beginning. Body language needs to be very important. Now, you need to know your own dog, of course, but you need to look at the small steps that the dog is indicating discomfort or excitement, whether it be raising its head or sniffing the ground or yawning, things to do before it gets to whale eyes or trying to pull away or turn. And the critical distance, to me, that's the distance at which the dog will first become over threshold. And so starting outside that distance, the dog is calm. You gradually move your way closer. And like Patty said, then you start doing your mechanics of how to treat because the dog has noticed the trigger. And the goal, of course, is to get it to refocus on you. But that's so important to know your dog's body language and know when it's uncomfortable or excited.
That's a really good point. Not only that, but as you mentioned, if they are too close at that critical point, as you called it, that's when you're going to see what people tend to call them the bad behaviors. If they're barking, lunging, overreacting, you're too close. So you need to pay attention to what your dog is doing before they do those so-called bad behaviors, because those are the subtle signs you need to look for and take note of so that you can change it there before they hit that point of overreacting. Is there anything else anybody wants to add as far as body language?
The other thing to be aware of, like I have a dog that he's got very fast reactions, and he can literally go from sitting there laying on the ground looking calm like he's doing right now, basically laid on his back, to standing up, lunging at the window just with the snap of a hand. And it's important to be aware. I am constantly keeping a vigil about what's going on around me, because I want to know if something that's potentially going to trigger him is going to happen. So it's being aware of that, and it's also being aware of, the food bar can open, but the other thing that you can do that works really well is if you have the option of moving the dog back away from whatever is causing the issue for the dog, and then moving forward and moving back. And you could do this like in a figure 8 motion, or you can do this. There's lots of ways you can do this, but it can also, you can use that for counter conditioning to get them to see, oh, that's not so scary if I approach it that way, because they may not be ready for a treat at that point if there's a lot going on. And especially with service dogs, we don't always get to choose where they're going to jump into being overexcited in a split second. And it's on us as handlers to learn how to manage those situations with our dog. I'm lucky that when Nick is doing general PA and out and about in the world, he generally is pretty non-reactive. At home, it's a different story. He's real quick to respond to stuff. And in pet-friendly places, he's more likely to respond to stuff than he is like if I go into the grocery store. So, but it's, you have to be aware of what the triggers are as well. Like I know cats are a trigger. I know loud music's a trigger. So But it's about teaching them that, and it's not always a food reward. I think we need to emphasize that because, you know, Patty's lucky she's got Goldens that take food like crazy probably. And I don't have that option. Nick spits food if he's not up to taking food, and it's a spit. It's not even, it's like he'll put it in his mouth and he'll spit it out. And it's important to have tools when you're dealing with that, like figure eights and U-turns, so that you can take the pressure off the dog and get them moving. So that when you start to see that body language, you can take them away.
There is kind of a common thought that if they won't take food, they're too close. But you really know your dog, because that can be an indicator. If your dog normally takes food everywhere you go, and then all of a sudden they stop, then yes, you're too close.
Right, but that's not Nick. We'll be working.
Yeah.
We'll be working in the house and he won't take food.
I think
Right.
the flip side of that, I think the flip side of that though is with very food motivated dogs. Like I'm around a lot of labs, and George likes food as well, even though he's a spaniel. And I think a lot of those dogs you need to watch out, because they'll always take food, even though they might be stressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that can lead to a whole nother situation where the dogs are actually conflicted because they want the food, but they don't want to be that close, but they want the food, but they don't want to be that close. And that builds that problem.
And that's where doing things like walking figure eights with your dog. And when you walk a figure eight with your dog, you can actually, it's going to become very clear what the body language is. You'll see them, they actually relax. If they're excited to go see whatever's ahead of them, they're going to move towards that. They're going to want to move towards that. If they're trying to get away from it, they're going to pull away from it. And so you can actually see, and then, but the change in pace while you're walking the figure eight will help them learn to regulate their emotions and their speed. I don't recommend training figure eights in the situation. That's training for the situation, so that when you do get in a situation when you need the figure eights, they're ready for them.
That's actually on my list to discuss, so we'll get back to that one.
Okay.
So unless there's another question specifically about body language, if somebody has a question, I want to give them a minute about body language. Okay, and the next thing then, I'm going to actually add two categories together because they do go together. There's flooding and trigger stacking. So first of all, if you don't know what those two terms mean, flooding is imagine whatever you're afraid of. So for me, it's mice. And if somebody constantly was dangling a mouse in front of my face, I would get flooded really, really quickly and shut down. So that's basically what flooding is. When you work on a situation too long for too much and too often repeating the exposure, your dog becomes flooded, and then any kind of work you're trying to do almost becomes totally ineffective. It doesn't do any good because they're too easily over threshold at that point. Trigger stacking is similar, but a little bit different. So for instance, with Azul's issue with dogs, he gets overexcited with dogs. So if we're just out and about in our normal course of day and it's been a hunky-dory day and he sees a dog, he's going to get overexcited, but I'm going to be able to get him back in relatively quickly. But if he sees that dog and then 5 minutes later we see another dog, and 5 minutes later we see even a different dog, and maybe the next time we see the Bigfoot statue that scares him, and so it doesn't have to be the same distraction or the same scary item. But when you add up stress upon stress upon stress, that's trigger stacking. So one day you might be able to work 50 feet away from your distraction and the dog might be chill at 50 feet away. But another day that dog may be having issues at 100 feet away because they've had more in their day on that day that stress them out. So they're basically trigger stacked and need some time to back off. And that's also really common, like if your dog has been attacked by another dog, they're more likely to be in that heightened sense of fear, shock, whatever, that triggers stack up really, really quickly in those situations. So you just kind of want to keep an eye on that. When it comes to desensitization, I think it's important to keep an eye on those two terms, because you want to avoid flooding your dog when you're doing the training around something that either, scares them or gets them overexcited. And you also want to make sure that whatever day you're planning your training to do on that you're giving them lots of calming activities before, and you're not doing it on a day where lots of bad things have happened. And if that's the case, then you just decide you're changing your plan and you're not working on your desensitization that day because they are already too escalated. You'll just do it another day, kind of thing. You don't want to build on top of building. Anybody else got tips with flooding or trigger
Well,
stack?
Penny, what I would say is, rather than not work on desensitization that day, don't work on desensitization to that particular item. Go home and work on calm behaviors in the house. Give them a long lasting chew and either stick them in the crate to chew on that or stick them on the mat, and reward them highly for being calm in the house to get them back in the calm side of in the calm, relaxed, happy quadrant. So that give them a good 72 hours to calm down before you start working on the trigger stack, before you start working on the issue again, if they're getting close to threshold.
Yeah, I was trying to read a comment as well as it scrolled past. So,
Okay.
but yeah, that's, I think, really, really important. I don't, like, say it is dogs that is Azul's problem, that's his major one, but say it's squirrels, it really doesn't matter what it is. If I've set up a training session around that, and before we get to that, a bunch of other stuff has happened, I'm going to change my plan and not do that. I'm going to, as John's comment just suggested, and take a sniffy walk, because sniffing does help relieve tension. Also licking, sniffing and licking are the two dog things that can help a dog come down from stressors in
And
life.
chewing.
And chewing, yep. And so then I might do totally away from my distractions or whatever it is that I had planned to work on. I might play some games that focus on arousal up, arousal down, or that on off switch, that in the end, those games are going to impact my desensitization training that I want to do, but they're not exposing him to the trigger on that day where he's already had too much stress. Anyone else have any tips there? All right, so next,
I'm in to say that I really like the sniffy walk tip, and I use that sometimes, especially if I'm having a really long day. I'll keep a long line in the car, and if we're out for 6 to 8 hours without a break, or George will get potty breaks, but if he's having to be on his best behavior for that amount of time, I try to make sure he gets a nice long break to sniff.
Well, another way to simulate a sniffy walk, if you can't get a sniffy walk in, is to do a scatter feed. If your dog is into this, my dog is not. He won't even scatter feed in the house, and he won't go for a snuffle mat. You can do snuffle mats and you can do scatter feeds. Some dogs just go nuts to scatter feed and vacuum the lawn and get all the, whatever you're feeding them in the lawn up off the ground, and that allows them to sniff and hunt and brings their levels down so that their stress levels come down. And that can be a really good alternative to going on a full-on walk. But again, you've got to have a dog that is a foodie, not a dog that's, I don't care if I eat. And I have a dog that's like, I don't care if I eat.
Yeah, Azul is
Wouldn't,
like, go ahead, John.
wouldn't a reward such as a treat or the flirt pull, not a treat, but a toy, flirt pull, maybe a few seconds of playtime without a toy, work just as well as a food reward?
Yes, I use a lot of other toys and things like that, the flirt pool. The other thing I was gonna just add that I use quite often is the sniffing, and that's why I had mentioned the sniff walk. So Azul's one of his highest reinforcements out there is actually sniffing. He loves to do it. So I will specifically go to an area that I know is dog smell rich, I guess. I know the area smells, but there isn't going to be a lot of dogs in that area at that time because of my time of day or whatever. And I'll just sit down and allow him to thoroughly smell that area really, really well.
Mhm.
So he's coming across a bunch of new smells that way. It could be like we have a deer enclosure in our area. So of course that smells a lot like people, the deer and dogs that walk around it all the time. So there we're not likely to run into another dog that's really close to us at that point. So Azul can stay under threshold and we can just chill and sit and relax. So it's part of the act of holding still, but also giving the dog the chance to smell what they want to smell instead of having it the mission be from getting to point A to point B. So yeah, I use a lot of toys and a lot of things. Even people are another high reinforcement I use for Azul. So being able to say hi to people. So if he's had a stressful day, I will make sure to go find a few strangers that want to pet him, which is easy in our area because everybody loves huskies and he's a husky. So almost
Part,
anywhere.
I just want to interrupt you here for a minute, Penny. Part of the issue with using toys is you've got to make sure you use the right kind of toys and the right kind of play, because you don't want to amp up. If you've got a dog that's close to threshold or going over threshold, you're trying to get the dog down lower than threshold and get him as low as possible and calmer so that they can deal with, the deer that runs by or the other dog in the park without just completely losing it. And so if you do something like flirt pull, you're teaching them, energy up, energy down, and thinking and arousal, but it's not necessarily the right time if they're over threshold to do that. You're better off to be teaching calming behaviors at that point and rewarding calming behaviors, like bringing them home and giving them a meaty bone, or bringing them home and give them a frozen licky mat, or a stuffed Kong, or Nick likes these things called retriever rolls, giving them something like that and letting them just relax, but they're having calm, active rest, as opposed to just, like right now he's sleeping on his bed and he's pretty much been there since I ate dinner because that's where he's supposed to be right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've spent a lot of time with Azul on the flirt pulls and the tug toys, getting him into an area where like he knows if I'm playing in a calmer way or if I'm trying to amp him up based on how I play, how long I let him chase, or how often I stop and ask him to do an alternate behavior. He can generally tell, and I can generally control his up or down because we've worked at it so much. So
Right.
you don't get their number one favorite toy if that's just going to amp them up. You want to use something that they love, but something that you can help to bring them back down.
And if they are at or over threshold, it takes a good 72 hours to get them calmed down and back in a calmer state. And as service dog handlers, we do want our dogs in a calm, thinking state. We want them to be able to respond to us, but we don't want them, hyper vigilant with us. So the goal is to teach them to be calm, but aware. And so we want them to be able to think arousal up, arousal down with the dimmer switch rather than just a light switch where they're on or off. But we also need to make sure that, especially as service dogs, that they're getting that time to chill out. Like Patty does a really good job. Rainey and Jazer have a pond in the backyard and they get to go swimming and fishing. And they have golden retriever heaven back there. You know, I have a little bit more of a struggle because I live in a 1-bedroom apartment. But the idea is, you know, we want to teach them the tools to use and give them the tools to use to bring themselves back down to calm so they can do it no matter what the situation is we put them in.
Yeah, that was a very good point. The 72 hours that she mentioned is the time it takes their hormone levels, the cortisol levels, to return back to a normal. So your dog might seem calm, 5 minutes after, or a half an hour, or an hour after, but they still have that elevated level of cortisol flowing through their body and are more likely to then react to something else with the trigger stacking for 72 hours. So our next part, and kind of tied in what I was thinking and what Patty had mentioned, is kind of the set it up as a training before you just have it occur naturally in life. And so breaking down the steps. So for me, especially when it's something as common as dogs, I want to make sure that I have a lot of training opportunities around dogs and people that know me, that know what I'm working on, that can do certain exercises. I have a whole ton of exercises for getting focus around dogs, but so that you can do something at the same time, you can tell the other person, hey, stop, back off, don't move, that kind of thing. So whatever it is you're working with, you want to start with the distractions you can control. Like the dog park is easy to control because you're not controlling the dogs inside the park, but you have awesome control as to how close you can get. None of those dogs are generally coming out and running toward you. If you have that kind of dog park where people go in and out off leash, that might be an issue and might not be the good place. But so if you choose things like that you can communicate with and control, you control another person who has their dog on a leash and their dog is doing what they're supposed to be doing with that person, as opposed to a dog that's off leash running around doing nothing, or that squirrel. When you're looking at something with wildlife, it's a little hard to be able to control it. So I might be more likely to have Azul look at a squirrel when we have a fence barrier in between us and the squirrel, because then I know that kind of helps take away that chase drive, because he knows he's not going through the fence. So I don't want to create the fence, that boundary frustration, but yeah, I know that's going to help him remain calm. So then we might be more likely to work on a squirrel that we can't control. So make sure that whatever that distraction is that you're trying to desensitize and counter condition to, you want to set up your training in advance. A common one for service dogs is general watching people walk around. So I know there's a lot of people that will all of a sudden their puppy is, potty trained, has basic manners, and they rush them into a store, but this dog has never really been around people that are walking past them. And so a good way to set that up in a training session is to start in your car. You can park as far away from the door as you need to, outside on the outside edge of the parking lot, and make sure your dog gets calm there. Over different sessions, you can slowly move your car up closer to the door. Eventually, you can go back out further in the parking lot and actually get out of the car and slowly move closer to the door. So things like that, if you set up the training session based on where you think your dog is, and then willing to move back, you're not really controlling those people in the parking lot that are walking into the store. But when you're in your car or when you're out walking your dog in the parking lot, you can control whether you're getting close enough for them to feel comfortable in approaching or not. Once you get within 10 feet, they may want to approach you whether you want to or not. But if you're working 20, 30, 40 feet away, most people will leave you alone. So you want to make sure you set up that training based on where your dog is and slowly get them comfortable to it. Working first with the distractions you can control the most and slowly building up to the distractions you can't control.
And
Does
some-
anybody have any tips there for setting up their training?
yeah,
And I know
similar.
this is right into Patty's breaking the steps down more.
Similarly, you can go to a park and do the same thing. And those are nice because then there's usually running, screaming, yelling children. And that's actually a good thing to get the dogs used to as well. Or setting up a group, if you are familiar with other people who have dogs, having a training group that's meets on a regular basis and where each person can work on their specific issues, so that somebody may be training formal obedience for a competition, somebody may be working on rallies, somebody may be working with the reactive dog, somebody may have a brand new puppy, somebody may be working on agility basics. So to have a variety of things that might be going on, but also to have those other dogs around that are close, that aren't necessarily interacting with your dog in a somewhat controlled manner, or even just taking a class. And maybe you already know everything that's been taught in the class, and maybe your dog knows everything, but just for having your dog have to think about what's going on in the class.
All right, and that kind of leads us into Patty. Do you want to talk a little bit about breaking down that criteria or splitting it up into baby steps? I'm sure is what you meant by your comment there.
I took a really good class at Finzi on feelings change. And the first thing she talked about was training plans and setting them into tiny little steps. There's two different processes, what I was saying in the chat, the desensitization, which is the part of slowly getting closer to the trigger. And the counter conditioning is whether you're using the toys or the treats or whatever, but everything that you plan and what you're going to use, if you have a written plan to start with baby steps, and if you get in there and you see the stress signs, if the dog isn't totally relaxed, then those steps are too big and you need to make them smaller. I had a dog that was extremely scared of popping sounds after, Shy had a 21 gun salute went off next to him unexpected when he was like 5. And the fallout from that was terrible. And I did his desensitization and counter conditioning behavior modification with a veterinary behaviorist at the vet school. And his steps were so small that's one of the places people, just like in training when we lump stuff, that's one of the places we have problems. The other place is in mechanics that I was talking about earlier, but on the plan, you want to make sure your steps are small enough. You want to make sure your mechanics are right.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very, very good point too. And some of it depends on what the dog's reaction is to that trigger. If your dog is extremely fearful, then you're going to need a lot smaller baby steps in your plan. If your dog is, mildly interested or unsure, you might be able to get away with some bigger steps. If your dog is just mildly excitable, then you might be able to get away with those bigger steps. But if your dog is quickly going from like 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds, because they're so overexcited, you need itty bitty tiny little steps.
The distance is a huge part of that. With when we were doing the gunshots, the very far off hunters that you could barely hear would trigger him. So we couldn't even do the gun in the neighborhood. That's how bad the distance was with it. And Donna Hill worked with me some, and she had me even try a pop gun, and I couldn't even do a pop gun at a distance with him. So distance is a huge thing with it. That is, as with anything we're working with, especially when you're talking about excitement.
You know, another point that comes with the baby steps, Patty, is they're going to make steps forwards and backwards. It's not a straight line up.
Well, you don't want any steps backwards though.
You don't want to, but they're going to have better days than other days.
If you trigger it,
Then you
that's
need
your
to come
whole goal,
back.
never to trigger it. That you're better off going too slow than having to go backwards. And you know, you can see your dog and their days, I'm sure you're gonna want to back up with it. But just when you're doing that, if you are having to back up, those steps are too big to start with. And anytime it gets triggered in this process, sets you way back.
Right. But to prevent that from happening, you're going to have to step back at times, because if they're having an off day, you're just not going to work on that. You're going to find something, because they have good days and bad days.
I usually don't start where I was anyway. When we come
Yeah.
in for a session, I back up to where I know that he is, and any step I make is short to start with, and then I back up to
Mhm.
where I was. And I'm not going to do this when he's in excited or, you know, anything
Right.
going on with him, where y'all were talking about calmness. The calmness is so important. Along with what we were doing, his doctor had us working with Karen overall relaxation protocols and different things like that. So it's those calming things are so important that y'all were talking about.
Yeah. But it's important there to be reading your dog to make sure you're not pushing them too far on that, and to take those steps extremely slow.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about, those little
Yeah.
tiny steps, and you have to always be sure that you're not going over threshold.
Yeah.
I agree with Patty about not backing up. If you are recognizing that your dog is not in the state of mind for that activity, then it's time to do something else instead. Do an
Right.
alternate activity rather than backing up on that trigger.
But you don't, what I'm saying is you don't want to be, they're going to make forward steps. And if they're they're going to make backward steps, they're having a bad day. That's not the day to be working on it. That's the day to find something more enjoyable for them to do than working on something that is, you know, potentially going to be more difficult. Like with Nick, I'll just give you an example. This isn't counter conditioning, but Nick, I'm working with doing a deep pressure therapy, and he doesn't like it. So we're going extremely slow on getting him in the position. And I don't ask him for the final position. I know he knows how to get into it, but I'm working on, just because I want him to get into the position correctly. And I think that we need to do that with all of our training, but we also need to read our dogs on what's going on, because if you're asking them to do something that they're not ready to do, you're setting the dog up for failure. And the whole point of doing positive reinforcement is to set the dog up for success.
I think we get into a little bit of the semantics. Patty and I are referring to backing up as backing up in the training program.
Right.
I think you're referring to it as the dog almost physically backing up away from the trigger.
I am referring to it, they're emotionally not able to handle it that day. So you
Right.
don't work with it that day.
Yes, I agree with you.
Because I've seen too many animals that you push them through something and you get so much fallout from it by, if you push them on, you know, maybe they did it yesterday, but you know, they're not there where they're even ready to go where they started yesterday. Maybe emotionally they're back where they were 2 weeks ago, that particular day, because something happened that you have absolutely no control over. Like they got a shot, or, you know, like they had to get their shots. And while they've been trained to get their shots and tolerate their shots, the shot makes them feel icky, you know, because if you get an immunization, it tends to make you feel icky. Well, that's not the day to go out and work on counter conditioning. That's the day to go, okay, well, we're going to work on something that's much easier for you. And, not something that's going to push you a little bit more. But no, I don't think you should be taking backward. You should be taking forward steps ever so slowly when you're teaching, when you're showing them, teaching them that something is not it's not scary. You want it to be their best friend.
Right. That's one of the things that makes it extremely hard if you're working on things you can't control. Because, I mean, for instance, with the dogs in Azul, there could be any given time where we could pop around the corner and see a dog. Now, I can usually tell long before we get to a corner because Azul will smell a dog anywhere. So that rarely happens, but say it did happen, then I definitely have to quickly put distance in, but that means the next day that I plan to do a training session around dogs, I need to probably back way up in my plan, like Patty was saying, where I know he can be successful and where he's going to make those slow baby steps getting back to where he may have been, the last time, but that's just where I know he's going to need to start that day because of that. So every time we have that surprise encounter for whatever our trigger is, that sets us back even further and does a lot of damage. So when what your trigger is something that is really unpredictable and out of control, you really got to do safeguards to make sure you're only taking your dog into environments where that trigger is not going to happen.
That's so important. You
So, I work with a friend. She's actually part of the OTSD group, and she won't care that I'm telling her story. So she had her and her dog were in an elevator and had some pretty significant trauma in that elevator. And so we worked with her and her dog a lot to get her dog and Azul very comfortable, because Azul is super confident and has always been confident in elevators and everything. So we first wanted her dog to feed off of Azul's confidence. Then we also wanted to just be able to walk past an elevator. So for the first probably 4 or 5 training sessions we did, our goal was to choose places in public where we knew 100% we were not going to run into an elevator. That's kind of easy to control because there are a lot of places where there aren't elevators. And then the first elevator we actually exposed her to was it was a hotel lobby. So the dog that was afraid of the elevators was able to stay on the far side of the lobby, a good 40 feet away. We were able to walk past once together where we both were, far 40 feet away, walked past it, went and did other training in the hotel. So we had focus, we had everything lined up perfect. And then just before we ended our training session on that day, the other handler walked towards the exit door. So she was close to the exit door. She could get out at any moment when she needed to, if she needed to add more space. And Azul and I walked past the elevator. And so the first time we just walked past, and the other dog handled that really well. So then Azul and I walked past, hit the button on our way past, but kept going. So the dog actually, we wanted to make sure she knew it was an elevator there. And since it was in a hotel she had never been in before, we weren't sure. So we hit the button once, and that was it. That was all we did on elevators that day. Then we did some more work where we avoided the elevators for a while. And the next time we set it up exactly like that, only Azul and I walked into the elevator and back out, with this other dog sitting a good 40, if not more feet away, watching us. So, I mean, we slowly did get her worked up, and I don't think she's tried more than 1 or 2 elevators totally on her own, but probably the last, maybe we've been in 30 elevators successfully together without any problems. And I know that Jen has had Betsy in at least 2 or 3 elevators on her own without us, which was a big one for her. So you really have to make sure that you're keeping an eye on what that trigger is, so that if it's something that's easily avoidable, like elevators, you want to avoid it at all costs until you get your dog to the point that you're ready to work on it. And if it's something that's harder to avoid, such as, you know, like I can avoid dogs pretty much because I can walk on trails early in the morning, late at night, on a rainy day, whatever, when I know that there aren't going to be a lot of dogs on that trail. But there are some triggers that you just can't avoid, like maybe the truck driving down the road. You have no control over that. You can avoid walking near busy roads, but you might live in a quiet neighborhood where you think this road very rarely has trucks. I might be okay. And then all of a sudden, here comes a UPS truck. You know, so there are some times when the trigger is harder like that to predict, that you might accidentally trigger your dog in a way that you didn't expect. And every single time that happens, it sets your desensitization training back. So you got to do your absolute best to choose locations that avoid those triggers, except for when you're actively working on your training plan. And then you're doing it very slowly and cautiously.
And sometimes that's really, I'll just tell you from experience, sometimes that's really, really hard to do. Nick loves cats and squirrels. I think his name should have been Alf, because he wants to chase the cats, and there's cats all over the place. And he has literally woken me up in the middle of the night to go cat hunting. He's never been allowed to cat hunt, but he has woken me up and he's taken me outside and he's looking around like this, like he wants to get a cat. And I just bring him back in the house. Nope, we're not cat hunting. But it's important to be aware of things like that. And then to have a plan in place. Okay, how am I going to exit this situation if I know my dog is having an issue that we need to counter, that we're still working on this issue, and we have an unavoidable or very difficult situation? And that's where some of the tools like U-turns and figure eights can come in. But we don't want to have to, if we can, if at all possible, we want to avoid having to use those. But like Nick's issue, it's not, I'm reacting because I'm afraid of it. I'm not worried about him being afraid of it. I'm worried about him hunting. So that's, you know, a very different issue. And if he was afraid of it, I would be looking at different counter conditioning with him.
All right, so we are almost at 10 o'clock. So I just want to double check. I know we have a bunch of experienced trainers here, but I want to make sure, does anybody have any questions about anything we've discussed so far? If you do, go ahead and unmute and ask your questions. Or you can type them into the chat as well.
Mine's more theoretical because I've never run into the situation, but you know, I'm pretty confident in my ability to do desensitization and counter conditioning, but I'm curious what you would do, like if you owned a dog reactive dog in a big city like New York or Seattle. Is there a way you could make the DSCC work, or would you have to just take a total management approach then?
That's okay. Do you mind if I address this, Penny, since I live in town and you live in the boondocks?
Go for it.
Okay, so I live in an apartment complex. I basically live in an urban area, and it's a management issue as well as a counter conditioning issue and desensitization. So and this was really hard to do with Nick. There was a period of time where he literally did not go outside except to go potty, and we had nice weather. And we worked on a lot of games on thinking and arousal, calming protocols, quiet in the house, basically getting his personality dialed so that he has good house manners, except for the trash can I'm still working on. And is pretty calm. I mean, I can open the door and he's not charging out to get somebody unless it's somebody that routinely excites him, that he has permission, that that's their relationship. But it takes learning how to manage. So we've gone through, and you've been through part of the saga with this, where I've been ready to cry over, where I've cried over him, thought I was going to have to return him to the breeder, didn't know what to do as far as management to keep him under control without getting knocked on the ground. Now we're to the point we have a smiley leash clipped to a buckle collar when we go out to go potty. To get there, it's been a lot of games, and it's been a lot of counter conditioning and a lot of teaching disengagement, because I think that's something we forgot to address, Penny. To teach them not to look at the things that are their triggers, to look to you first. And so it's teaching them the disengagement, so they're looking to you, and that they re-engage and focus with you, while teaching management skills, going out and practicing walking the figure eights, so that you can teach them arousal up, arousal down while you're walking. And sometimes, and you need the front and back attachment leash, whether it's to, back of the harness, whether it's to the front of the harness, the collar, or the head halter. You're doing a figure eight so you can, kind of help them twist around and do their walking, and so they learn that they can walk at different paces, and how to do a U-turn. Nick's got about 4 different variants of a U-turn. Some of them are used for rallies, some of them aren't. Some of them are just, okay, well, this works for me in the moment, we're getting out of here. So you can get away from whatever is causing the issue.
Just a minute.
Pardon?
Can you stop you just a minute?
Yeah.
Great points. And there's a whole lot more to that than what we have time for tonight. But we can remind people, and I can put the link in this video replay, that we have that focus around distractions workshop that's available on the UberPause website, that really goes over that and those types of games, and act step by step teaching you how to do it. So it's a 4-part video series, and there is, we explain how you slowly get used to working around distractions and all of that. And a lot of good points we've gone over tonight, but we give more detail for that. And then games to teach the arousal up, the arousal down, the U-turns, the
disengagement games.
They're in that focus around distractions workshop.
I'd like to add onto Sarah's comment that management may involve traveling to a different location. You may have to, if you're urban, you may have to go out into the country to see the animals. Or if you're out in the country, you may have to go into the town to see elevators. So you may have to do some traveling in order to set the training session up the way you want it to be.
And you may have to do some management depending on where you live and how you live. You may have to do some management just to get out of the building, or just to get out of the situation where you live. Because, if you have a front yard where you can let your dogs run out to the car and jump in the car, that's great. But if you have a situation where you open the front door and there's a squirrel sitting there, and a cat, and 3 dogs off leash that don't belong off leash, you probably want to think a little bit more about how you're going to get to the car.
Yeah, that goes into my other tip for like what Sarah had mentioned, is you may need to get really, really creative. You may have to find alternatives. I know there's I think they started it as a joke, but they call it the 4 a.m. walking club, because that's the only time they can go out when there isn't a ton of people out walking their dogs. So that's what when they walk their reactive dogs.
Yeah.
That there may be other things too, like if your dog is specifically reacting to other dogs, and you're in an apartment building, are you able to work out on your patio where you're above the other dogs, but there's no possible way those dogs can get to you, or can you get your dog into the car and go someplace away from other dogs for the desensitization or the de-stressing, and then find an area where you can work around the dogs from a safe distance as well. So you might just have to get creative in the ways that you go about it. My reactive dog, Cam, my older German Shepherd, came to us at age 2, extremely dog reactive and huge separation anxiety issues. When he came to us, he was living in a trailer park. And there was absolutely no way they could work on the issue because there were too many of his triggers nonstop. This dog was so trigger stacked and so flooded, it wasn't, he couldn't do anything. So in that situation, you have to consider, do you need to look at a better home in a different environment for that dog? Because you're not doing the dog any good if they're constantly nonstop trigger stacked. After you've run through like all your creative options and you've done all your management and the best you can do, that is something you may need to consider.
And Penny brought up a point earlier when she was talking about working with Betsy about having a confident dog around when you have an anxious dog. Now, Poe is the epitome of confident dogs. They're just about nothing rattles her. And when I was having the vast majority of problems with Nick, I didn't have her here with me. And then I brought her back over here with me. She goes back and forth between my house and my boyfriend's place. And so I brought her back over. And when I was working with Nick on counterconditioning and desensitization with the next door neighbors, because they have a door they slam and he barks every time they slam the door and he'd bark every time they stood outside. And I mean, it was just a whole mess of stuff that was going on that was just, he was on edge the whole time. I brought Poe over. Every time Nick got close to even thinking he was going to react, he'd get upset, he'd start to bark, just start barking for no reason, or whatever he heard, didn't know. I couldn't tell what he was barking at. And I'd say nice, and I'd throw some kibble. Poe would go vacuum it up. And because Poe was eating, Nick would go eat. And so Poe was an integral part of getting Nick to calm down and focus on something else, because Poe was saying, hey, we don't need to worry about that. We just got free food. And, Poe works for Mini Milk Bones, so she was happy to get kibble. But it's, looking for solutions like that. I wouldn't have gotten Nick to the point where he's laying on the bed with his feet in the air right now, had it not been for Poe and having that help. So it's looking for solutions that will work for you. But I was considering, one of the other solutions I was considering was moving. So.
All right, we are about 10 minutes past, so I don't want to cut anyone off if they have something they're dying to say. But if not, I want to kind of end it there because I know we gave people a lot to think about tonight. And I know this is going to be one of our better videos, so I don't want it to go too much horribly longer so people decide not to listen. So last minute tips on this. Anybody want to throw anything out there?
I think one thing that's been essential for us in this tonight's discussion is the saying, train the dog in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Know how your dog is doing that day at that training session and respond accordingly.
And, the other thing is Patty brought up that Shay was 5 when the problems with the guns started.
Shy was solid, rock solid service dog, wasn't rattled by anything. And we were at a police memorial. My husband's a chief, and my fault. I thought he told me they were going to have silencers on those guns. And when they came in, they're right next to us, and they went off. It's like a battle zone. And the deputy chief was sitting next to me, and he saw it all, and he was just like me, just floored. And after that, he developed separation anxiety. He developed noise sensitivities to anything that sounds like it. And I had to pull him. But when I went to Mississippi State, she told me that was pain with it, that it hurt his ears even. And she said he had, at that time, they didn't have a PTSD yet code for dogs in behavior, but she said they were working on it. I think they may have now, but she said that's what was wrong with him. And she said any program would retire him. But him being private, and she knew that I knew all, I could do these things. And I had access to Donna Hill to help me too at the time. She gave me a 50% chance of rehabbing him, and partially. And within 3 months, she said that he was better than she thought in a year. And she used him to her peer groups for a case that she gave on behavior modification training. But I'm telling you, when you do a program of desensitization and counter conditioning, you need that treatment plan. You need to really understand mechanics. You need to use distance. You need to do these things about body language. It's so easy for it not to work and think that doesn't work, but it does. The other thing I want to mention, my trainer said that she uses a lot of desensitization by itself, that she's doing a lot of nail care without the counter conditioning and using pure desensitization. So that's what I was saying about they're two separate things. They're used wonderfully together. And you can also, with counter conditioning, add in some operant conditioning, but that's a topic we might do another day.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I was going to say is the need for this can come up at any age, regardless of what's going on. And it's especially likely to happen with our service dogs because they're exposed to so much more.
They certainly are.
And if in doubt, it's better to preemptively do some counter conditioning. If you know that there's potentially going to be a problem, try and do something. If you're in a situation, if you get into a situation where there's potentially going to be a problem, like Poe saw some big cats in a zoo, and she's never had a problem with cats of any kind, but we got her out of there and over to the dolphins, and she was much happier. And so doing that kept her from getting upset about the tiger that was trying to chase her.
A good example of that is fireworks. We usually know at least the rough about what time of year the fireworks are going to go off. And so we know that if we want to be able to take our dogs, like where I'm at, I don't hear fireworks from my house. So if I want to work on fireworks, we have to travel about 10 minutes away. And then we can do it multiple times. But so knowing that fireworks can happen commonly around July 4th, the week before, the week after, we can start to work on that slowly at home first with, the fireworks sounds on TV and movies from YouTube, whatever, slowly building up, working on some other louder noises that might be similar, but, again, slowly building up. And then the first time we're around fireworks, make sure we're a far distance away. So like usually my typical thing is I will be at least 3 or 4 miles away from, if not further, away from where they're setting the fireworks off, where I can start in my car, because my dog has already been heavily conditioned that my car is a safe zone and they're safe there. And if that's still too close, we're already in my car, I can quickly leave and get further away. And if all goes well in the car and they're feeling comfortable, then we can get out of the car there and walk around while the fireworks tend to still go off. They're still far enough in the distance. So when it's something like that we know are very, very common triggers, we can build up to it happening with the desensitization and counter conditioning before it becomes a problem. So Azul has never had a problem with fireworks. We've done that kind of protocol. We do it every summer again. The very first time we do it, we start in the car at a safe distance. And usually before the end of the 4th of July season, or, the end of our big fireworks season, he's okay with fireworks being shot off at the neighbor's house, So, but it's that slow process. It's something that because of his age, I know we have to build up to every year because it's so rare. It only happens in the summer. So we're gonna have probably 10 months of no fireworks, and then all of a sudden they're gonna be available almost every night if we wanted them, and we can still go home and avoid it. Whereas Jen and Betsy, fireworks trigger Betsy, but they live in a place that's more busy, and they pretty much get a month solid of fireworks nonstop every night from somewhere they can hear it. And no matter what they do, they get further out of town because she can't drive, and they don't go out after dark because it causes her seizures. So she really has to just do a lot of calming stuff and sheltering in place, and more, just doing what she can do to survive it, versus being able, like Betsy will never be able to go out and enjoy a fireworks show because she's so bombarded with it that month, leading up to July and after July. So you can kind of think about those known triggers and start ahead of time, especially the younger, the better, as long as you're doing it right at that safe distance and building up.
Mhm.
The one thing that is real important that I forgot to bring up is medication, and it's always better sooner than later. And when you talk about management that you were talking about earlier, when you can't avoid these things, just like fireworks times, you need to see veterinary behaviorist is the best, but I know a lot of people can't access one. You can ask your veterinarian, but they are so limited in the drugs that they can give you, but at least that's better than nobody. But if fireworks, anything that you can't get them counter-conditioned and desensitized to in time, they need to have meds. And that's one thing the doctor told me, that for times of anything that I have no control of, she gave me trazodone for him. And when he was real bad, he was on a long-acting drug and a short-acting drug. And she also told me the reason I was failing at my attempts for desensitization and counter-conditioning was he was so sensitized that he had to have medication to be able to respond to it. And then they weaned him off of it. So never be afraid of medication.
No, it's just one more tool for management, like a crate or a harness. It's a tool for management.
Very important one.
And that's the other thing is crates are really handy for this, because Nick goes to dog shows and there's always lots of barking. And I usually end up putting him in the crate for an hour or two in the back of the truck, in the back seat of the truck with the doors closed on the truck, and let him sit back there, because that's the quietest place I can have him, and just have him calm down for a while back there. And because then he'll go to sleep, and he may not otherwise get a chance to rest. So, you need to look for solutions. We're not looking for problems, we're looking for solutions with this.
All right, we're gonna end the first hour there. I think we covered a bunch of, really, really good tips. I'm not telling people they have to go away, because we can still sit back and chat and don't have to worry so much on format, but I want to be able to have an ending time for that video so that people know the meat, the most of the meat in this topic are in this first video, and then we can continue on. So no, I do want to
I'm
thank
going to
everyone.
say goodnight to everyone. Y'all
Good
have a
night,
great
John.
Good night.
Good to
Thanks
see
for
you.
joining us.
Good
My
night,
pleasure.
John.
Thank you for
People always
hosting it.